Hello there. In this video, I will be talking to you about why the Greens, as a political force, that is the Greens party in the Western world, is such an impotent and useless political force, and why they are actually necessarily worse for the environment than better for their own existence. What I'll do is walk you through how they are so ineffectual and asinine, and then I'll also outline exactly what the change would need to be for there to be significant redress and the spurring of change in the environmental policies of first world economies. So I think first and foremostly we can understand their ineptitude related to their ability to hold political power and office in any serious measure, and that is functionally zero. They participate as, if not bystanders, then participatory award level or tier actors in parliaments around the West. So you'll find almost no presence in America, and then nominal presence throughout Western Europe, with maybe the highest proliferation in Central Europe in countries like Sweden, Germany, Denmark, etc. And from this notional presence, we can gather a few important details, I think. Firstly, that ecological protectionism is actually an important policy, particularly to large swathes of the demographic polity. And I would say I also think it's quite an important topic to maintain a strong policy on. I think the second level is it's never enough of a standalone to offer any valence to the rest of the political landscape. You can't drive such a niche party issue into your identity, because necessarily you alienate the plurality, and in doing so you become a very ineffectual political power. It's basically the reason that they are woeful is because of their own structure, the way that they've set out on themselves. It also plays in a little bit to how we think about winners and losers, and that everyone who is a green advocate in that way is strongly associated to the losing side of things. They're always the underdog who is trying to protest and make themselves a nuisance with their malfeasance, things like that. And this does not engender much support from the bulk of the populace, because people like underdogs, but they like underdogs who aren't annoying. They like them when they're noble. And there's nothing noble about green and green protesters and associated parties, because they're an underhanded and insidious bunch of people. I want to center maybe the talk on nature and ecology, because I feel as if it's become suborned by the progressives in this sense. So the entire conceptualization of nature as a harmonic and partnership in what we call life, I think, is obviously ancient. It's not like it was invented or something recently, but Goethe, and I've done videos on this before, it was a very strong proponent for our ability to appreciate and understand nature maybe more deeply and philosophically from this post-enlightenment period, in which we were much more obsessed with what we could get out of nature rather than necessarily living with nature in a harmonious and synergistic way. There are other writers that were influenced by him, one of them being Emerson. So Ralph Waldo Emerson was an American philosopher who's a transcendentalist, and transcendentalism was a philosophy basically designed around supplanting existentialism, or nihilism I should say, in a way that was to be in tune with nature and to be harmonious in your ability to handle. It was almost like the positive version of a stoic, basically, in a lot of ways, where we have in the discourses on transcendentalism a certain sense of peaceful being and belonging. So Emerson here writes, and this is the first quote here: "Make no mistake, progress is the lust for power and nothing besides, and we must unmask its method as a sick, destructive joke. Utilizing such pretexts as necessity, economic development, and culture, the final goal of progress is nothing less than the destruction of life." And his position, which is taken from his works on nature, it's called, is, I think, the best way to preface the position here, which is to say that no society which is manifestly obsessed with progress like ours is, can also pocket or square away the ability of themselves to rein in and maintain that progress when it's encountering nature, because in a lot of cases it's mutually exclusive that you can engineer something and grow and push things without destroying some other thing. It's almost entropy in that way. It's an inviolable rule. And so from that nature of ourselves, we get this quite, I would say, negative but burdensome aspect, which is that we seek to either exploit nature or at least abuse it in a way, I think, that is not necessarily beneficial. So I think that's a fair position to take, and I would definitely agree. And Klages, who is another German philosopher, goes on as well in nature, and he has a large work called The Biocentric Worldview, where he says that nature is always consistent. Though she feigns to contravene her own laws, she keeps her laws and seems to transcend them. She arms and equips an animal to find its place and living in the earth, and at the same time, she arms and equips another animal to destroy it. Which I think paints the perfect parallel and matching ability for us in the way that once you can understand nature gives and takes, which I think we all instinctively know, but in a way that we cannot have our cake and eat it too. The idea then that we are animals we're predators, beasts of prey, and so in that we are manifesting our own attributes towards killing or be killed, and particularly when it comes to living. So our whole nature is engineered towards the destruction of other things to feed us. And this can go even into, as vegans and vegetarians eating plants, obviously you have to destroy the plant to consume the plant. It all offers the vim and vitality from its energy source, and mitochondria, everything relates to how energy is produced, and the more energy requires more productive capabilities from the energy that's consumed. So we have, I would say, a very natural relationship towards destruction, but in that way that there's a misconception from the Greens parties here, where they take a very peaceful and, I would say, détente relationship with action, with violence. It becomes effrontery to them to have to actually engage in conflict in that way. They don't like to advocate for war. All Green parties are peaceable parties in that very nonsensical way that we understand armistice and the world without violence. It is very soft and postmodernist way of living, where we can feel as if we're ethically and morally above and superior to our own nature. We're so far away from ourselves because of our comfort levels and our privilege that we no longer have to have these animal human considerations anymore. We can be morally superior to them. Which obviously is just hubris and arrogance of such a degree that allows them to think that politically they can encapsulate the idea of defending nature against us the evil humans, rather than we as nature taking control of nature due to our own behaviors and our systems. So in that we can then frame, I guess, the party, what the Greens party is about, is a hypocritical, contradictory party in itself. It tries to frame the innocence of nature using the tools of violence in a way that's supposed to be anti-violence and pro-nature. So it's confused in how it's been able to first conceptualize itself and then obviously try to commit to that message in a way that's actually feasible to get power. Because, I mean, why would you start a political party if you're incapable of obtaining power? You obviously would not. And in doing so, what you do is make a farce of the whole process, particularly when it comes to, and as I'll go on to say, their own policy mechanisms and descriptions. So I think it's fundamentally built on this non-aggression principle, albeit we won that by engineering nuclear weapons, that it's this fanciful utopia that we can have some magical realm of make-believe and fiction where everyone is harmoniously living and progress is only tracked in a way that's never damaging for the environment. And they instinctually know that this is not possible. It's an unfeasible, untenable position. But they still advocate for a slightly, well, facsimile to this anyhow. So it's obviously very annoying to have to deal with this nonsense. So I'll go into a bit more as to why. But you can first, I think, understand the opposition of pollution and externalities in a positive way. I think everyone would like a habitat and environment that is beneficial to their existence rather than deleterious. There's no instance of almost anybody wanting to live somewhere that pollutes them, both personally and obviously the broader animals that they interact with and eat and things like that. You'll notice, obviously, that there's large silence when it comes to green parties in the realms and states which actually do the most polluting, and to no surprise to anybody, it's mostly the third world, wherever Western countries have outsourced their productivity, industrial productivity at a large scale. So thinking things like East Asia, South Asia, Indonesia, Mexico, and Africa, some places in South America as well. There's just a large influx of basically industrial grade chemicals, and the burning and pollution effect from utilizing all these systems is massive. There's no cap in those third world countries for anything like lead or plastic, microplastics, or sulfur, NO2, things like that, NOx, sorry, nitrogen oxide. So there's a whole issue here where the West has been able to be, I don't think, gullible enough to fall for it, but at least has tried to dismiss its own culpability around pollution, whereby we've almost abrogated our own level of responsibility to it, which is an embarrassing farce once again. I think the rise of neoliberalism basically contributed directly to this, and we can see here in these charts that post 1950 you had almost exponential growth in almost all six of these measures of greenhouse gas and air pollutants, whereby the sharp and acute effects of these are things like acid rain and you could say pollution deaths, which were severe, and in London itself had several, obviously, smog and asthma related or lung related illnesses and deaths in those times. And so what would we do? Well, we would found a Green Party to deal with these things necessarily, rather than maybe thinking about politics more holistically. We have to be very specific in this. And then I think this plurality in Europe is obviously detrimental to uni-party systems which actually function and get things done. And now all you do is fragment politics into so many small subset on minor issues that there is no valence around these things, and you cannot imbricate everyone into this circle of agreement and acquiescence. It becomes a fight, and you polarize topics and issues rather than being sensible. I took some of the, well, here you can see the green protesters clashing against the opening of Tesla's Berlin factory and saying no to nuclear. Obviously in Germany, as I said before, one of the most moronic green parties to exist, whereby you have an entirely non-existent nuclear power now in Germany from an energy generation standpoint, whilst also not actually minimizing their natural gas, hard coal, lignite, things like this, and oil consumption. So to deal with excess generation, they've obviously gone towards solar and wind, which aren't necessarily greenhouse gas free emitters, rather than on the operating level they are, but obviously in the construction phase they are not. And they also require upkeep and technical maintenance, which is also one of those other things. But in general, there's been a very anti-scientific approach here in Germany, whereby nuclear was seen as the evil energy source, and that the good guys of solar and wind were obviously there to address this, not understanding that energy generation is always lumpy and cyclical, and that you cannot not actually, without large-scale batteries, offset the grid disruption. So naturally, Germany has to pipe in a lot of its natural gas, as well as continuing to maintain coal facilities, which pollute on obscene levels, particularly not even CO2, but much worse greenhouse gases. In any case, the Green Party is still favorably seen to a degree in Germany, garnering between 5 to 10% of the national electoral vote, and they participate in the European Parliament in something called the Green or 090, I think it's called, coalition. And so some of their policies here, which I've taken from their policy document, I think I only took 2 here just because the whole document is obviously not worth your reading time, as it's a very painful thing to but I did admire the contradiction that they laid out in basically 2 back-to-back paragraphs here. So first, they've told us that freedom is realized through self-determination. We are calling for emancipation and self-determination. Our approach to freedom has been shaped by a variety of emancipatory movements, libertarian and liberal traditions. We want a society where people have the opportunity to fashion their own lives without being told what to do. So I think this is perverse, maybe, for a governing party who wants to control people's lives to actually state as their, well, at least prima facie tenet. But then they go on to say, ecology demands sustainable economic and technological policies, which will force you to adopt, obviously. No nation can attain the goal of sustainability in a go-it-alone approach. International cooperation is essential. Now, I do wonder, bear with me here, how exactly you would enforce cooperation if there was an actor who would cheat in the, and this type of game theory is very common, whereby the strategy in a ongoing game, a repetitive game, is always to undercut your opponent. So say, why would I agree to something when I can undercut you every single time and be better off? So if I can pollute and continue to pollute and produce cheaper goods in a way that doesn't inhibit my own country's economics, why would I ever choose to do this? Well, the only way you can do it is if you enforce it. And if you enforce it, then you're no longer really looking at self-determination, but an enforced policy of obedience and obeisance. And to do that, you obviously have to use force and power. And that's why you would have an overarching government in any case, is to enforce your will. And if your will is the socialism of environmental policy, then that's fine. But embrace that. Have the guts and gall to call out the fact that you are interested in enforcing upon people a certain way of life. It's the dishonesty which I can't approbate. And here you can see why. I mean, every time you see a green politician, they are the most effete and or harridan shrieking, it's just, once you don't use power in a, I would say, disclosed and upfront masculine way, you channel energies which are undermining your authority and make you come across as insidious and duplicitous. And this is what you get. You get schemers. And schemers are always distrustful, as in we would distrust them from a polity standpoint. You don't want someone who you think is going to lie to you. And in this case, I think they get called watermelons, because a green politician is a watermelon in the sense that they're green on the outside and red, as in communist, on the inside. And it bears out almost in every instance that the intentions and the nominal policy statements do not ever match what when they're in power, their outcomes and their actions, which is much more around enforcing and controlling, particularly when it comes to egalitarian, and this is separate to their environmental policies. Basically, every other policy that they do hold is progressive for progressive sake. It's the opposite of whatever this is, self-determination. It's, we're going to enforce hate speech laws, and we're going to make sure that you must maintain a certain worldview and Weltanschauung, and that's ours. And more or less, I also think that that's fine, but I think the hypocritical nature of the Green Party in general is what sets me off so much about this. It's perverse. And I think it probably is borne out in the demographics. The people most likely to vote and choose green almost always tend to be what you would call liberal democratic, which is, once again, the people who got us here, the ones who were for polluting in the first place and behind all these greenhouse gases were liberal Democrats. They were the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, people obsessed with growth and the way that untempered growth was being able to uplift everyone economically and making sure no one's in the poverty level, rather than thinking more holistically about what that actually means. And so the nature here of the voter for a Green Party is, I don't think it's satire as much as it is a very predictable caricature of what we think. I think then also, I mentioned before that we have what is a crises of conscience, and that we want to make sure that we are protecting the environment, but also growing economically. We can't have one side saying, yes, we can always have more and growth, the other side saying we have a sustainable ecological mindset. These two things are mutually exclusive. But I don't trust a Liberal Democrat to ever keep or maintain a bargain whereby they're promised to balance these things. I think that the nature of politics at the moment, because it's so money driven, then you'll always get the people with more money, which is the businesses and businessmen, who are more obsessed with growth and economics than they are with maintaining a certain level of balance, of equilibrium in the world. And this is a celestial equilibrium, not an economic balance of trade. The idea that somehow Elon Musk, who started an electric car company and wants to colonize Mars, is the evil guy here, and that the protesters against electric cars are the good guys. This is the moral standing that we have, is that we're anti-capitalist, except when the actual in the shadow politicians and businessmen are agreeing on expansion of, say, coal power plants. It's we'll dismantle nuclear, which is against everyone's interests other than the NIMBYs. It's this very contradictory mindset which I can't necessarily abide. And the nature of, I think, the misunderstanding of economics has contributed to this. So because, as I said before, the competitive advantage of our countries was our industrial strength all the way up until the 1920s and 30s. And our attitude towards that was one of snobbishness. We thought the proletariat and labor class were so insignificant and awful that we decided it was best if we actually made other countries make these things for us where the labor was cheaper. And because communists and labor activists sought a minimum wage, all that did was drive work to the third world, because when you think economically about a industrialized economy, you see, okay, there's inputs and outputs, and the cost differential is what maintains a profit margin. But in doing so, we basically outsourced all our intellectual IP as well. So our know-how around factories and design and industrial processes went along with all of the labor. So we double lost in that eventuality, just down to the idea that market uplift from a wage first standpoint was going to save what was the economies of Europe and America. Obviously, the rooster has come home to roost here. We have to pay the piper, or whatever idiom you prefer. But in general, we can understand the mismanagement of an economy to be the direct contributor to the global deterioration of the ozone layer, of increasing greenhouse gases and pollution. All these externalities are directly attributed to the West's greed, and in a way that was post-World War II to basically what is 2005, 2006. This monomaniacal obsession with growth, and growth for growth's sake. And so I think that's where most of the burden should be borne here. It's in previous generations, say like boomers and maybe Gen X and a little bit of the silent generation, in that their incapacity, their inadequacy with comprehending their own actions has led us down this path. And it's obviously one that's almost unfixable if you think about microplastics, for instance. In any case, diatribe aside, I think it's important for the idea of green or ecological or nature and preservation discourse to disentangle itself from pollution. I think on one hand we get very obsessed with things like climate and climate change, rather than understanding the pollutions distinctly of themselves. So like I said before, microplastics, or whether it's sulfur dioxide or it is carbon dioxide or monoxide. Each of these interacts very fundamentally differently to the environment around it. So pollution is not one for one, just CO2 equivalent. It doesn't work like that. There are gases you would rather breathe. So to understand which ones are most deleterious to our health and to the broader environment are the most important things. Like acid rain is obviously going to be much worse than if you have a slight higher level of CO2. These things are not equivalent. And you get most of this from energy generation. It says here, if you don't know if you can see, but about 75% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to energy. And energy generation is used obviously for loads of things. But in general, if we can think about economies all transitioning to something like nuclear, then we probably have a drop, what is a functional drop of like 90% of this number. And in 2 or 3 years, your energy problems will be solved. So these are technological problems. Now, green parties are obsessed with getting away from technology because to them it undermines what is this idea of balance and not progress for progress' sake. But the savior here is the same thing that got us into this pickle in the first place, which is our own insatiable greed for growth. And if technology can create a problem, it can also solve a problem. These problems don't exist in vacuums. They're a culmination of an entire series of events. And once we know the cause and effect of these things, we can then surmise what is the best outcomes. This teleological principle is fairly intuitive for anyone who's actually worked with technology in any way. We have continuous growth of technology companies solving previous problems which have borne out of or been a byproduct of other technologies. It's just the nature of the way that we function. So understanding that, I think, is just something also that should be natural. And this idea of balance, I think, gets a little bit away from the core principles of conservatism. And we conserve things in a way that is almost one-to-one with how we consider ourselves part of nature. And the most nature-first governance principles in the last century or two have been from what we would call, I don't want to say exclusively fascists, but fascist-leaning third-way governments. And so you can see here with Teddy Roosevelt, he established what was basically the largest single act of increase in public lands and parks, and more or less a complete revival and reservation for bird species and larger mammals and things like that, along with other really beneficial projects that Roosevelt had. He was obviously just a strong man who had a strong will towards protecting what he felt to be the indefensible or the innocent. And in that way, I think his nature was borne out in his actions. It's much less around talking about all of these policies around tariffs and taxing and small incentivizations for electric vehicles than it is actually just to do the thing that you want. That's power. That's how you understand it. That's how you understand motives and actions in how they intertwine. Mussolini here also had something around this. So to continue the strongman theme around protectionism, it is imperative that we create, we, the people from this epoch and this generation, because we have the duty to make the face of the fatherland unknowable both spiritually and materially. In 10 years, comrades, Italy will be unrecognizable. This will be because we will have transformed it. We will have made a new one from the mountains, which we will have covered with their green coat, to the fields, which will be completely reclaimed. Mussolini himself being often seen in propaganda photos out in nature and being a man of the people, in that he was able to understand the life and the trajectory of a peasant's being in a way that they were in touch with nature much more than the rootless urbanite who is seeking the large megalopolis concrete jungle. And thirdly, we have here the Nazis actually, and this is from our green study done on who governmental effectiveness of green policy said that Nazi leadership has ardently championed renewable energy and institutionalized organic farming and land use planning on a level unmatched by any nation past or present. The environmental policies might seem like a welcome departure from the rest of the Nazi program, but their environmentalism was actually grounded in the same racist worldview that shaped the Holocaust. Now, I'm not sure how that second sentence actually is congruent to the first, but nevertheless, we can see that environmental policy was actually, we might say, a neo-reactionary policy. It was the same energy and the same intuition that brought us the heroic ideal and this man of nature born out in the storm. So someone like Odin, the Allfather, who was or even Thor, someone who was able to attune themselves to the very beat and rhythm of the celestial universe in a way that becomes overlapping and synergistic. I think we go into what is probably the final paradigm, which I'll touch on here, which is around the idea that politics can be a force for transcendental good, and that if there is the political will for this idea of protecting and nurturing and benefiting the world and lowering pollution, then it can be done. It doesn't need to be through this green party. It doesn't need to be through a prism of weak, ineffectual, effete governance. It can be done by strong men who want things done. This is why Trump, I think, now has an opportunity here to actually grasp what is the inflection point of the century. To say we can go in a direction and pick now whether we take technology and harness it in a way that's productive towards the organic life on Earth and the galaxy more broadly, or do we continue this charade of party politics whereby nothing gets done and we have to sit through another 50 years of microplastics being leached into the soils, seed oils being poured into foods, and medicines and other pollutants being dumped into rivers? Which one do you want to choose? Which outcome, which political force do you want to align yourself with? Is it the strong, hard winners, guys who embrace the adversity of life, the Bear Grylls or the Ace Venturas, or is it the villains, the losers, these ones who are sucking away all the life and vitality of living in the way that they must govern and preach, but not actually change and grow?